Hello, Amber Eisenchank from the League of Minnesota Cities here again to discuss with you the electoral processes in Red Wing that you use to elect your city council members and mayor. The current system that you use in Red Wing is commonly referred to as first past the post, meaning that the person who has the most votes gets the office. Some of the advantages to first past the post is that it's easy to understand. Simple count who has the most. It can be quick to count those votes and declare a winner. Voters can express a clear view on which party they want in government when we're talking about offices that have some sort of party delegation. And in a two-party system, it has normally produced a single-party government with a clear mandate on who is to be governing. Some disadvantages to first past the post include candidates may be elected with less than a majority of the vote. That would happen, of course, when you have more than two candidates running. It encourages voters to be tactical with their votes, where people vote against a candidate that maybe they most dislike. And many votes may be considered wasted, either those cast for a losing candidate or those for a winning candidate past the level of votes that they actually needed when you have maybe elect two in this race type of a question. And a disadvantage is that less popular candidates or those from smaller political parties aren't going to get elected in most situations. When we talk about wasted votes, you often hear that with like presidential elections when we talk about voting for a third party candidate. So why might you want to make a change to your current voting system? And the main argument would really be that majority rule doesn't always serve the majority of the community, including those people who didn't vote because they maybe didn't think their vote mattered. Some of our cities in Minnesota have recently made the change towards ranked choice voting, which is something you're going to be talking about, where you cast your vote for a candidate, but for the candidate to win, they must receive a majority vote. So you cast your first place vote and your second place vote is kind of the easiest way to understand it. So if a candidate doesn't win with a majority on the first place vote, your second choice vote would then go towards candidates describing how are the candidate with the most votes that way, and then you go to third choice and fourth choice until a candidate has received a majority of the vote. So it's a different system. Minneapolis has been using it the last few election cycles, and St. Paul will be too. Red Wing has pretty good voter turnout. Election turnout in Red Wing in August 2014 for an election primary in a non-presidential year, 13% of registered voters in Red Wing voted. Non-presidential election years, generally the voter turnout is lower, especially for a primary. In this past election cycle, in November 2016, for the general election, of course in a presidential year, 80% of registered voters in Red Wing voted for the mayor. So that's great voter turnout, very on par with our voter turnout in general in the state of Minnesota. So comparing Red Wing to other cities of similar size, in November 2016, of course, I said Red Wing had 80% of registered voters voting in the mayoral race. Winona had the same, 80%. Hastings was at 21%, so a bit lower. One thing that is unique in Red Wing is that you are a charter city. There are two types of cities in Minnesota, charter and statutory. A statutory city finds all of their governing rules and law from state statute. So it's created by the state legislature, and it sets the framework for how your city is going to be operating. Red Wing, as I said, though, is a charter city. So think of a charter as a local constitution of sorts. It sets forth several principles for how your city is going to operate. Charters do give you more local control. That is the basic argument for wanting to be a charter city, is just having more local control and more say in how your city is operated. I will point out some of the differences that you have because you are a charter city compared to what statutory cities are allowed to do. In Minnesota, we have 853 cities, and 107 of them are charter cities, so about an eighth if you're doing math. So because you are a charter city, you do have some authority to have initiatives and referendums where statutory cities are pretty limited. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes about the different ways that citizens can participate in the decision-making process that would normally be just up to the council. People join, so every city with a charter must have a charter commission. It is an ongoing body, 7 to 15 members, and it is usually appointed by the chief judge of the district court of the district that you're in. So in most situations, it's the city council making a recommendation to the chief judge to appoint those residents. You must be a resident to be on the charter commission, to be part of the charter commission. So usually it's maybe past city council members who are still interested in serving but don't want maybe the whole commitment of being on council, or it can be residents who are interested in the government, city government, and want to learn more about Red Wing and what you're doing, how you're regulating your city. So it's an interesting job, and I would encourage you to check it out if that interests you. A charter commission, as I said, is an ongoing body, and your role as a charter commission is to study the city charter to make sure it is what is best for your community. Again, that local control piece. So your city charter may be great, maybe you don't need any changes, and that's just fine. So you would just meet annually in that situation. Or maybe your city council or city staff or residents have found an area that your city charter needs to be amended. And that's something that you need to study and think about. And as a charter commission, that you would take those referendums or amendments to your charter to the city council for their approval and or to be put on the ballot for voters to approve. So there's a couple different ways that you can make amendments to the city charter. A little bit more back to the election process. Red Wing officials, elected officials, do not run under party affiliation. In Minnesota, local government officials are not to run under party affiliation, so that might be different in different states. But in Minnesota, they don't. So you won't go to the ballot. You won't pick up a ballot and see an R, D, or an I next to anybody's name. Elections, council races are, of course, cost money. You see all those yard signs and mailings and things like that that candidates have to raise money and spend money on. The most competitive November 2016 city council election, the elected officials spent about $1,700 in cash. That did not include in-kind donations. So there is money to be raised, but it certainly doesn't have to be that much. It could be more, it could be less. That's just to kind of give you an idea of what Red Wing elected officials are spending. The mayor of Red Wing represents about 16,000 people. So each of the council members who only represent one ward would theoretically be representing about 4,000 people, because those wards are supposed to be equally broken out as close as practically possible. And then the council members who are representing 2 wards then would be representing about 8,000 people. Because you are a charter city, residents can pass initiatives and referendums, and there is a difference between initiative and referendum. When Red Wing residents want to pass an ordinance initiated by themselves, so not something that the city council has considered, not something that the charter commission has considered, that is called an initiative. And it can require that ordinance passed by the city council be put on a ballot for voter approval. That's a referendum. So if it's the residents bringing something forward to be an ordinance, that's an initiative. If the council has put something forward and maybe residents aren't happy with it, that's a referendum. The content of these decisions must be legislative and cannot include zoning, authorizing tax levies, the salaries of city staff, or other similar issues. So how does this work? Any group of 5 voters, this is for an initiative, any group of 5 voters can assemble a petition which must be filed with the city, in which the city clerical official will determine whether the proposal is appropriate for that initiative effort. So again, it can't be, it must, the content of these decisions must be legislative, but not that zoning, tax levies, or salaries. And if the clerical official determines that it is not an appropriate topic, then the group the 5 individuals can change their proposal and refile. If it is considered appropriate content for an initiative, the individuals must gather signatures of registered voters that equal 5% of those people who voted in the last general election for the city. If the number of signatures are insufficient, the supporters of the proposal have another 30 days to come up with the remaining necessary signatures. If it does meet the 5% rule, the clerical official must present the initiative and number of signatures to the City Council. If the City Council rejects the petition, the process stops, but can start from the beginning with the Council's feedback. If the City Council accepts the petition, they must vote on it within 30 days. If they do not pass the ordinance or pass it in a form that 2 of the 5 initial voters finds undesirable, the question is sent to voters in the next general election. If the initial group of voters gathered 10% of registered voters, the council must call a special election for that initiative. And if the majority of voters approve the initiative, the measure passes and it becomes an ordinance of the city. So again, that's the process for initiative. That's something that the residents are bringing forth themselves. For a referendum, the process is a little simpler. A referendum, of course, is that city council has passed an action and the residents aren't happy with it. They want to change it. So for referendums, you need 5 registered voters, again, to create a committee. For the ordinance to be stopped, the individuals must receive signatures from 10% of registered voters who voted in the last general election. If the signatures of 10% of registered voters is received before the ordinance is scheduled to take effect, the ordinance is stopped temporarily. Once these signatures are received by the City Council, they must recognize the ordinance and vote to repeal or vote again in support of the ordinance. If they vote again in support of the ordinance, the council must call a special election to send the ordinance to voters to decide, or wait till the next general election. In the meantime, though, that ordinance cannot take effect. The content of the referendum must be published in the official newspaper of the city, and the ballot will give voters the option to vote yes or no on the repeal of the ordinance. If the majority of voters vote in favor of the repeal, the ordinance will not take effect. If the majority of voters vote against the repeal of the ordinance will take effect immediately or on the date specified in the original ordinance. So another unique characteristic about having a city charter is that elected officials can be recalled or basically removed from office. And that is not something that statutory cities have the power to do. So that's unique to charter cities and specifically Red Wing. So to recall an elected official, any group of 5 voters can assemble a petition, which must have at least 20% of registered voters' signatures. If all the petition signers' signatures are considered legitimate, and the way that that's considered legitimate is they are checked to make sure they are registered voters in the city. That's done by city staff. The council would then plan a special election for that recall. The ballot will contain 2 separate questions. The first asking whether the official should be recalled, and that would be like a yes or no question. And the second question asks the voter who should replace the elected official. If the first question receives a majority of no's, the official is recalled. If more than 50% of the voters identify the individual who should replace the recalled official, that person is considered elected. If no one receives over 50% of the votes, a special runoff election of the top 2 candidates must be held within 45 days to determine the official's replacement. So that's a little bit more about the electoral process specifically to Red Wing as you are a charter city. Stay tuned for more. So another unique part of the Red Wing Charter is that you do have the power to recall elected officials. And by recall, we mean remove them for reasons. Maybe they are taking actions that are inappropriate for the city or things like that. So to do that process, as I said, it's unique to charter cities, and specifically the Red Wing Charter does call out a process for recall. Statutory cities do not have the power to recall their elected officials. So to do that, any group of 5 voters can assemble a petition, which must have signatures from at least 20% of registered voters of Red Wing. If all the petitioner signatures are considered legitimate, the council plans a special election. For the signatures to be considered legitimate, they need to be legible, so you have to be able to see who signed it, who has signed the petition, and city staff would be going through those petition signature lists to verify that those folks are indeed registered voters of Red Wing. The ballot for the recall would contain 2 separate questions. The first question would be asking, should the official be recalled, with a yes or no option. And then the second question would be, if the official is recalled, who should replace them? And you would have candidates' names listed. So if the first question receives a majority of the vote and the official is recalled from their office, you would then look to the second question to see if more than 50% of the voters have selected the same candidate, then that person would be considered elected for this now vacancy. If no one receives more than 50% of the vote, a special runoff election with just the top 2 candidates from that question would be held within 45 days to determine who would be the replacement of that official. So that's just a little bit about your electoral process in Red Wing, and stay tuned for more.